Good afternoon and welcome to the American Floral Endowment's Grow Pro webinar series. I'm your moderator, Brian Schulker. I am a member of the AFE's Young Professional Council and a third-year PhD candidate at North Carolina State University, studying horticultural growing media. My research encompasses the hydrologic dynamics of growing media with a focus on water use efficiency with renewable substrate materials. But that is enough about me. Today's session that you're all here for is on finishing your poinsettia crop successfully. On behalf of the endowment, I'm excited to be a part of this Grow Pro webinar series that features a new topic every month presented by an industry expert. Webinars are free to everyone thanks to the generous support of AFE's sponsors. If you'd like to learn more about the webinar series, or if you are a supplier and interested in becoming a sponsor for the topic, you can find that information on AFE's website at endowment.org/GrowPro. We'll say, it does make me want to say GoPro a lot. Today's session was pre-recorded in English by Dr. Chris Curry, and after the presentation, Dr. Curry will join us for a Q&A. Feel free to submit your question through the Q&A feature or chat at any time. We'll answer as many as we can before the end of the hour, and unanswered questions may be answered through a separate email exchange. I will be moderating both of those, and so please feel free to submit them whenever that question pops in your head. This session is being recorded and will be shared to AFE's YouTube account. Through YouTube's accessibility features, you can access closed captions in other languages. To get us started, I'd like to share a bit about today's expert speaker, Dr. Curry. Dr. Chris Curry is an assistant professor at Iowa State University. His controlled environment and greenhouse crop research is focused on providing research-based best management practices to support commercial producers of ornamental and food crops to improve productivity, profitability, and sustainability using and managing light, temperature, mineral nutrition, and plant growth regulators. In his scholarship of teaching and learning, his goal is to identify effective methods to increase student confidence and success in greenhouse crop production and increase student understanding of timely and important related to greenhouse crop production, such as local food security, and native plant production. Chris, welcome and thank you for presenting today on new technology in pesticides for flower crops.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Brian. I appreciate it. Like Brian mentioned, my name is Chris Curry and I'm from Iowa State University. I have a three-way split here, so I work in research, extension, and teaching, and it's been great to get out and visit some poinsettia growers already this fall. So I'm happy to be sitting here today talking with you about how to finish your poinsettia crop successfully. We couldn't really cover how to grow a poinsettia crop in its entirety because that would take several of these Grow Pro sessions. So what we're going to do today is focus on that home stretch with growing your poinsettias. And really what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we get here? So we've got poinsettias that are nearly fully colored up with respect to their bracts. You can see that their cyathea are well formed, and we've got some high quality and marketable plants on the screen. And what are the steps that you need to take to make it through this last phase during production to produce a high quality crop on time? So before we get into the weeds and some of the specific content, I just want to go over and highlight some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So for today's presentation, I really wanted to try and focus on a couple of key points. One, talk about our growing environment. That includes both the air temperature as well as light, both light quantity, instantaneous intensity, and cumulative quantity, as well as photoperiod. I'm also going to talk a bit about plant culture, primarily fertilization, as well as growth regulation. And that includes suppressing growth as well as promoting growth. And finally, I'm going to focus on physiological disorder, the most common one that we experience when we're finishing a poinsettia crop, and that's going to be bract edge burn. And so this is a little bit of a preview or coming attractions for what we're going to cover today. So let's start out with growing temperatures. When poinsettias first are in the greenhouse, that's going to be one of the warmest times of the year, especially for those of you who are direct sticking cuttings into containers. We have very warm greenhouse temperatures, and slowly that's going to moderate as the outdoor temperatures start to get cooler. Now, during this finishing phase, there are a couple of key pointers to managing our air temperature to produce that high quality poinsettia crop. First, we want to try and maintain our nights at or below 65 degrees Fahrenheit during that flower initiation once the short days have already started. One of the things that we really want to try and avoid is running the risk of heat delay that can happen when you have warm night temperatures. Now, heat delay can occur under a couple of different scenarios. One of them can be for those early season crops or those crops that you're forcing early using black cloth. You can have heat building up underneath that black cloth when the black cloth is pulled over the crop in the late afternoon or early evening. One way to avoid getting that heat delay under black cloth is going to be, one, pull your cloth later in the evening over the crop and then leave your crop covered more in the morning. That's going to allow you to let some of that heat from the evening dissipate before covering your crop. And then in the morning, you don't have that same heat in the greenhouse that's normally associated with that later part of the day. Another strategy to avoiding heat delay under black cloth is going to be, if you have automatic black cloth, retract that cloth that's over the crop in the middle of the night or once it's dark outside. That's going to allow some of that warm air to escape from underneath that black cloth and hopefully avoid those temperatures that could cause heat delay. Now, in addition to managing our night temperatures to promote flower initiation, we can also run cooler temperatures to try and promote good color development on our bracts. Specifically, during those last 1 to 3 weeks during of production, try reducing the air temperature, the night temperature, down to anywhere from 58 to 62 degrees. And this is going to help really bring out that good coloration for the bracts that are developing. Now, one thing to be careful for is this is not going to be something you're going to want to do with all of your poinsettia varieties that you're growing. Specifically, this is going to be something that's going to be more well suited for those dark green leafed varieties. Using those lower night temperatures from 58 to 62 is not going to be recommended for those lighter leaved cultivars, okay? So you want to keep that in mind when looking at this strategy. And although I know that we get tempted to push the boundaries of how we're going to manage our air temperature, we want to avoid very low temperatures, around 50 to 55 degrees. One, we could potentially run into root rots, and that's going to be problematic, especially when we talk about bract edge burn later on in our seminar, as well as overall plant growth. And we never want to get less than 50 degrees Fahrenheit because that's going to potentially result in cold damage to your crop. And once you get visible cold damage on a crop, there's really nothing else that you can do to try and grow out of it, especially once we've got our flowers formed and we've got our bracts formed. There's no more leaves that are going to be forming that could potentially grow over any crop damage. Now, on the topic of growing cooler during this finishing or this later part of production, I want to talk a little bit about cold finishing. AFE has sponsored a lot of cold finishing work in the past, and it's really something that can enhance the profitability for greenhouse producers given the right scenario. So we know that the profitability of poinsettias has decreased. The margins can be slim, but there are still benefits to growing poinsettias. You still might grow them to pay fixed costs or those overhead costs associated with production. You also might do it to try and keep labor on year round or keep employees on till the busy spring sets on, or it might be something you're growing to help keep your customer base happy and keep them coming back to you throughout the year. So again, one area to reduce costs and increase profitability is to reduce those energy inputs. Now, since supplemental lighting is not always used for growing poinsettias, the other source and the primary source of energy consumption is going to be in heating our greenhouses. So here we have a picture of just a couple of different cultivars, Prestige Early Red and Christmas Feelings Red. This is an example of some research that was conducted by Roberto Lopez and Brian Krug, and they were kind enough to share this slide with me. Now you can see here, we've got 3 different temperature regimes. We've got sort of a standard 75, 67 Fahrenheit day and night air temperature. Then we've got 70, 62, and 68, 56. And we've got 2 different time periods where these images were taken. One is going to be 4 weeks after the start of reduced temperature forcing, and the other 8 weeks after the start of reduced temperature forcing. And when you compare the plants, especially at 4 weeks after the start of reduced temperature forcing, you can see that both the Prestige Early Red and the Christmas Feelings Red that were grown under the 70-day 62 night or the 68-day 56 night are a little bit behind in bract development. But when you look at those crops 8 weeks after reduced temperature forcing, you can see that they've caught up comparably to those plants that were grown at the more standard 75-day and 67 night. You can notice that there is a little bit less bract expansion at the two cooler temperature regimes used when we're comparing them to those that were grown under the standard temperature regime. But I think that we'd agree that they still are a marketable and high quality poinsettia crop. Plus, you have to consider the reduced energy consumption, the reduced fuel consumption that went into growing this crop. Now, in order to successfully cold finish a crop, there are a few things that you want to do. It's not suitable for all cultivars. Much like the cold temperatures at the end of production are more suited for those dark leaf varieties when we grow at 58 to 62, same thing's going to be true for cultivars suitable for low finishing or suitable for reduced temperature finishing. One benefit is that many of the genetics companies have started to highlight which cultivars are going to be well suited for cold finishing and which cultivars may not be. So that's going to help guide you in your cultivar selection. Now, one thing to consider is that when we have those cooler air temperatures, we have slower developmental rates. That's a fundamental plant response. And we saw that under the two cultivars grown under those two cooler temperature regimes. So one way that we can make up for that is planting our crop a little bit earlier to get a little bit extra growth earlier on before we start the cold temperature regime for cold finishing. This is going to be something that's relatively easy to do because what is a poinsettia competing with for space in the greenhouse in the summer? Not much. Granted, there may be some garden mums that are going to be grown indoors, but still the majority of garden mums are finished outdoor on nursery type pads. So that earlier planting is not going to be competing with other crops in the greenhouse. And the overhead costs during the summer, or the costs that might be associated with that extra bench space in the summer, are not going to be as high because we're not heating our greenhouse. We're just going to be running our fans and our pads for cooling. Now, when to reduce temperatures, you want to start a few days after short days have begun. This is going to be usually around early to mid-October. It depends on if you're doing a natural short day crop or if you're going to be using a black cloth crop. Depends entirely on your schedule. But you want to let short days start for a few weeks until you start that cold finishing process. So let's move on from temperature and we'll talk a little bit about light. So both light intensity and photo period are important for poinsettia growth and development, as well as that finished plant quality. The photosynthetic light, and when I say that, we're talking about instantaneous light intensity, as well as cumulative, the daily light integral, are going to decrease throughout the poinsettia season because we're starting under those sunny conditions of summer and early fall, and we're ending in later fall and early winter. Now, one thing to think about when we're talking about the quantity of photosynthetic light is, like I mentioned, supplemental light is not frequently used on a poinsettia crop. And again, some of that will go back to the availability of that equipment as well as the cost benefit analysis of using it on a poinsettia crop. So since we're not using supplemental light, we want to try and maximize the transmission of that natural sunlight or ambient light to our crop. So we want to go into the fall with clean glazing material. If you've got whitewash that you've used or that you maybe painted on your glazing material, make sure that that's already off if the rain hasn't done the job for you. You also want to try and minimize or have minimal overhead obstructions. That could be some of the equipment you might keep in the rafters. It could be some Boston fern baskets that you maybe are starting early for the spring season. Regardless of what it is, we want to try and minimize that overhead obstruction and maximize that transmission. Now, in addition to the amount of light we're getting, and perhaps maybe even more fundamentally important to that poinsettia crop, we're concerned about the photo period or the day length. As we know, poinsettias are a short day crop, and we need to have that long, uninterrupted dark period to make sure that we're going to have plants that are getting induced to flower on time. Now, for those growers who are going to be growing on a later short day date than the end of September natural short day, they're going to be employing either day extension lighting, where you extend the day with electrical lighting, or night interruption, or mum lighting is another way to say that, where we interrupt the dark period from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m. with lighting. And that's going to create that long day or short night condition to keep plants vegetative. So be sure that your lights are operating if that's the case, so you don't get premature flower induction. Alternatively, if you're inducing plants with short days, monitor to ensure you have functional black cloth if you're pulling black cloth to create those short days, or go into the greenhouse to make sure that you don't have any light pollution with your crop that could potentially be triggering a plant to sense day when you actually want that dark period. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the threshold for a plant perceiving day or night is right around 10-foot candles or 2 micromoles. One thing I would really encourage you to do is when you're trying to make sure if you've got sufficient day extension or night interruption light, or if you've got a tolerable amount of light and you don't have light pollution, is to use a light meter. Don't trust your eyes. Our eyes perceive light differently than plants. And so I don't want you to be needlessly worried about light coming into the greenhouse, or I don't want you to feel a false sense of security. So I would really encourage you to use a light meter to take a measurement in your greenhouse if you are trying to determine the light intensity, to make sure you've got the right amount of darkness, or to make sure that you have a sufficient amount of light to get that long day response. Right, now let's move out of the growing environment and let's move into plant culture. Like I said, for plant culture, we're going to talk about fertilization as well as plant growth regulation. So when we start growing our crops, you may be starting out with a fertilizer that it's got a higher proportion of ammoniacal nitrogen. And when I say higher proportion, I might be looking at 25% or more of the total amount of nitrogen in the fertilizer being provided by an ammoniacal nitrogen source. And that could be both ammonium. It could also include urea, because that's going to be converted to ammonium for uptake. Now, it can be common to use that early on in production when we're trying to get plants established, maybe expand those leaves and get good vegetative growth. But as the season goes on, and as we enter the short day period, and especially as we enter the time when we're starting to color up our bracts, we want to change the fertilizers that we're using. You want to transition to a fertilizer that's going to have less ammoniacal nitrogen and more nitrate as the season progresses. And that's going to be for a couple of different reasons. As the season progresses, we're going to have our short days and we're going to have our bracts developing. The source of nitrate in many fertilizers is going to be calcium nitrate. And that's going to be very beneficial because of the calcium that's supplied along with that nitrate. That calcium is going to help promote good bract development. And that's going to be important when we're trying to avoid bract edge burn. The other reason why we want to have more nitrate nitrogen in our fertilizer is because, like we just got finished talking about, you're likely going to be employing cooler air temperatures in your production, whether that's reducing air temperatures to brighten up bracts for that last 1 to 3 weeks, or if you're going to be doing cold finishing or reduced temperature forcing and growing your crop at a cooler temperature for a longer period of time. What happens is, in order for ammoniacal nitrogen to be taken up by crops, it's got to be converted to nitrate by nitrifying bacteria. However, under cooler temperatures, those nitrifying bacteria are less active, and that can result in a buildup of ammonium, which could potentially cause ammonium toxicity. And so that's something we want to avoid by using fertilizers with a higher concentration or proportion of nitrate as the total nitrogen form. Now, in addition to changing the source of our fertilizer and what we're feeding our crops with, we also want to look at reducing the total fertilizer concentration that we're applying to crops. Now, poinsettias tend to be considered a heavy feeding crop, and it's not uncommon to use 150, 200, 250 parts per million of nitrogen on a constant liquid feed basis with a poinsettia crop. Now, that's fine for early on in plant establishment, but again, once our bracts start to crack color, we want to take a different approach. When we start to see color on our bracts, you want to reduce your fertilizer concentrations by 25 to 50% for several weeks. want to start using lower fertilizer concentrations because the majority of our vegetative growth has already been achieved. Now, during those last few weeks of production, we can eliminate fertilizer in its entirety. And these strategies are going to help grow a stronger plant, help color up our bracts and get good bract development, as well as give good post-harvest longevity. Now, in addition to modifying the fertilizing and how we approach fertilizing our crop, we're going to need to worry about growth regulation. And there's two types of growth regulation that we're going to be looking at: suppressing growth as well as promoting growth. So I'd like to start with suppressing growth. Now, growth regulation for poinsettia can be sort of categorized into three different time periods. The first time period is going to be that long day period, or the vegetative growth period would be another way to phrase it. The second two time periods are going to be occurring during short days, with the second time period being short days before color on our bracts has started to show, and the last and third time period being during short days after we've had colors start to show up on our bracts. Now, each of these different phases have different nuances to what growth regulator and what type of application is going to be appropriate for use in suppressing plant growth. Now, while ultimately our goal is going to be to achieve all of the growth regulation or the growth suppression that we're trying to get during that long day period when we're growing vegetative growth, we still may require some growth suppression during the short day period. So I'm going to focus, since this is again on finishing poinsettias, I'm going to focus on that second and third period under short days, both pre-color and after color. So with the start of short days, there's going to be fewer PGR options compared to what we have during long days. During long days, we can really use any active ingredient. However, once we've started short days, we want to stop applying diminazide, fluoropyrimidol, or uniconazole. Common names for those chemicals would include B9 or dazide for diminazide, top fluor for fluoropyrimidol, and then concise or sumagic for uniconazole. During this short day period, but before color has started to develop on our bracts, we want to use either foliar applications of chlormequat chloride, 750 parts per million up to 1500 parts per million, or we want to look at a low dose paclobutrazol drench, anywhere from 1/10 of a part per million up to 2 parts per million. You'll notice that those are both pretty wide ranges, and it's pretty hard for me to give an exact concentration of what you should use, especially when we've got growers that are attending from probably Minnesota, maybe even some up in Canada, all the way down through Florida. We've got a large geographic variation, and that's going to affect how much active ingredient is required, or appropriate rather. But we want to focus on foliar sprays of chlormequat chloride or low-dose paclobutrazol drenches during that short day period before any bracts have cracked color. Now, the strategy is going to change once we start having color developing on our bracts. Again, hopefully we're getting all of our growth regulation completed by first coloration. You'll notice that with each later phase, I'm saying hopefully we got it done in the phase before this. And the reason being is, as we progress throughout this season, we're getting more and more into bract development. And ultimately, we'd like to control height because we want to moderate plant growth, but we want to have the biggest and most beautiful bracts as possible. So that's why we're always saying, hopefully we get our growth regulation done during the long days, or hopefully we get it done before color. We always want to try and reduce growth regulation or growth suppression as much as possible as those bracts are developing. Now, that being said, life happens. If you do need to control growth during that short day period, once color has started to form on your bracts, we're going to either use Ansimidol, Arest or Abide, or paclobutrazol, again, Bonsai or Piccolo. Ansimidol, appropriate concentration would be somewhere from 1 to 3 parts per million. Paclobutrazol, we're looking at 0.5 to 2 parts per million. And again, both of those applications are going to be through drenches. The reason why we're focusing on drenches at this phase is foliar sprays can have too much of a negative impact on that bract development. And like I said, we're trying to get those big, beautiful bracts. Now, poinsettias have a tendency to elongate at the very end of production. We commonly call this late stretch. Late stretch can be caused by a couple of different things. One, it can be caused by cultivar. Certain cultivars can just be simply more susceptible to demonstrating that late stretch growth habit than other cultivars. But the other thing is that as we develop those canopies, they're going to close. And what happens is, as the canopies close in, those bracts and those leaves are going to absorb more red light, and they're going to allow far red light to transmit down underneath that canopy. And far red light is the color or the spectrum of light that is responsible for promoting that stem elongation. So again, late stretch, be mindful of the cultivar that you're growing and know if it's a repeat offender, as well as those canopies closing. If you can put a little bit more space in between your crop, that might help with allowing more red light to get into that canopy and maybe suppress some of that stem elongation. However, we're also trying to maximize the density of plants that we've got, because more units per unit area is going to be a more profitable approach to production. So that's where some of these growth regulating strategies for late in the production cycle can help combat that stretch that might be seen as a result of closer spacings and higher planting densities. Now, we're not always trying to suppress plant growth. I think that's what we talk about most commonly, but sometimes we need to enhance growth. With poinsettias, we're often growing them to specification or growing to spec, where we have a maximum plant height and a minimum plant height. And we want to be above that minimum and below that maximum. And there are going to be times when we're trying to either increase plant size to meet that height, or we're trying to increase our bract size because perhaps some previous growth retardants have caused our bracts to not expand as much as we'd like them to. So in the case of where we're trying to promote height and bract expansion, we use a combination of benzoyladenine and gibberellic acid. And this is going to be commonly marketed or sold as Fresco or Fascination. Although most plant growth retardants are anti-GAs, and you may think, why aren't we just using regular gibberellic acid or straight gibberellic acid, which is commonly sold as Pro-Gib or Flora-Gib? That just doesn't work quite as well as using the combination of benzoyladenine and gibberellic acid together. Now, when using BA and GA, it's important to understand the correct timing to get the result that you want. Because sometimes, like I mentioned, we're trying to get more plant height. Others, we're trying to get greater bract expansion. Eric Runkle from Michigan State was kind enough to share some slides of some research that he had done demonstrating the timing of BA and GA sprays. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, we have our control plant. To the right of that control plant, we have plants that were given a 2 part per million paclobutrazol drench at first color. Like I mentioned, that's going to be one of those growth retarding strategies that we might use once we start to have color. However, sometimes if we start to have cooler growing temperatures and maybe lower light levels, subsequent plant growth may not be as great as we anticipated, and that growth regulator may be a bit too much. So that's where we come in with this rescue treatment of BA plus GA. Now, plants were treated with BA and GA, either 2 parts per million, top row, 3 parts per million, middle row, or 6 parts per million, bottom row, 10, 20, or 30 days after that first color and that paclobutrazol drench were applied. And what you can see is that the earlier that application of BA and GA was made on that 10 days after first color, we got a greater response in promoting plant height. For that application at 20 or the application at 30 days after first color, we didn't get as great a response in promoting plant height, but we did get a good response with respect to promoting bract development and bract expansion. You can also see that as the concentration increases from 2 parts per million to 6 parts per million, we got an enhanced effect, both in promoting stem height and in expanding those bracts. So here's another look. We've got an untreated plant without paclobutrazol on the left. In the middle, we've got our control plant that was treated with paclobutrazol drench. And then we've got a 3 part per million spray applied 30 days after paclobutrazol drench. Now on the previous side, we could see the the height of the plants change relatively easily on those profile shots. But this image is doing a much better job of demonstrating how those bracts expand when the BA and GA is applied near the end of short days, that 30 days after full color. While they're not quite the size of the control that was not treated with paclobutrazol, you can see that they're much larger compared to those plants that were treated with paclobutrazol and not given any rescue treatment. Now, one thing that you have to be mindful of when applying BA and GA is that repeated applications can cause bronzing of bracts. And if you look at this crop here, these poinsettias were treated 3 different times with 3 parts per million. Now, there's nothing wrong with the size of the bracts. They came out just fine. But if you look at the color of the bracts, clearly they're not of quality that we're looking for with a poinsettia crop. So you want to try and be mindful. A lot of times we say use lower doses multiple times with growth regulators. And that can be a good strategy to sort of moderate some of the risk that you might run into when using growth regulators. But this is one instant where repeated applications at a lower dose are going to result in a problem because, again, it can cause that bronzing and sometimes it can even delay coloration. That's one of the reasons why you want to wait until short days start to apply Fresco or Fascination, that BAGA product, in order to get a bump in height of your crop after the start of short days. So in order to have success with BA and GA, it's all going to come down to timing. To increase plant height, apply 3 to 5 parts per million BA plus GA 2 weeks after first color. Alternatively, to increase bract size, apply that same concentration range, 3 to 5 parts per million, 1 to 2 weeks before flowering at the end of short days. So that timing is going to help narrow down if you get the effect on promoting plant height or promoting bract expansion. Okay, so we've talked about our growing environment. We've talked about plant culture. Now we're going to move into physiological disorders. And for this section, I really just wanted to focus on bract edge burn. Throughout the presentation, you'll notice that I just used the shortened acronym BEB just because it takes up less space on the slides. But bract edge burn is the result of a calcium deficiency. And there are a number of reasons why we might have a calcium deficiency in the bracts of our poinsettia as they develop. First is going to be just sheerly the inherent physiology of Euphorbia pulcherrima, the poinsettia. The bracts are going to lack functioning stomata, especially on those marginal areas on the leaf, and at the same time, they're expanding rapidly. Another problem that we can have is environments not promoting plant transpiration. Now, I'm talking about calcium deficiency, and here I'm talking about transpiration. It's important to know that calcium is taken up passively by a bulk flow. So as water is taken up in plants, that is when calcium is taken up in plants. So we need water uptake, and that occurs when plants are transpiring. So if we don't have good transpiration, maybe we have low light intensities, or maybe we've got cool temperatures, we may not get sufficient water uptake and therefore sufficient calcium uptake. We can also have problems with our fertilizers. For instance, if we've got insufficient calcium in our fertilizer, we might just have a calcium deficiency due to inadequate calcium being provided to our plant. However, we can also have a calcium deficiency occurring in poinsettia bracts even when we do have sufficient calcium being provided, because calcium has an antagonistic relationship with magnesium. They're both divalent cations or positively charged. And when they're being taken up, they sort of compete for one another with uptake because magnesium is also taken up passively by bulk flow. If there's excessive magnesium in your root zone, that may suppress the uptake of calcium as by bulk flow. Although calcium does have an antagonistic relationship with potassium, we tend to see magnesium the cause of antagonisms more often in poinsettia than we do with potassium. And then finally, if we have root diseases that have caused root damage, that could cause a calcium deficiency, because if you have damaged roots, you're not going to have the same amount of water uptake, and you're not going to have that same amount of calcium being taken up by the plant. So how do we correct these? Well, let's again look at plant environment and plant culture for how we can try and prevent bract edge burn. So first, we can try and create those conditions that promote transpiration. We can increase our air temperature during the day when it's sunny out, and that's going to help promote that uptake by promoting transpiration. We can also make sure that we have adequate air movement around our poinsettia canopy. What happens is when you have a leaf, those stomata open up and you can have humidity building up right around that leaf surface. That's called the boundary layer. And that high level of humidity is just like if you had a humid greenhouse. It's going to reduce that water uptake because you have less transpiration due to that high humidity. But if we can have good air movement in our greenhouse and we can move that boundary layer off of that leaf surface, that can lower the humidity right around the stomata, and that can help promote transpiration. Another thing that you can do is use supplemental light, preferably in the mornings and the evenings, to try and promote transpiration. Now, this may or may not be an option depending on the costs associated with running your lights and if you've got them installed in your greenhouse. But increasing the light intensity is going to be something that will help promote transpiration. Now, we can also modify our plant culture to try and avoid bract edge burn in a couple of different ways. So first, let's look at our fertilizers. I mentioned that if we don't have sufficient calcium being provided to our plants, we run the risk of getting that calcium deficiency in our bracts. So the first thing is to make sure that you have sufficient calcium in the fertilizer that you're using. That's one of the reasons why 15-515 CalMag is going to be one of the most common fertilizers used for growing poinsettias. It has elevated levels of calcium that are going to be very well suited for growing poinsettias. It's also going to have a high proportion of nitrate, which is going to be good for those cooler air temperatures. The other thing that you want to do is avoid excessive magnesium applications. Actually, just this week, I was working with a grower who had supplied so much calcium in their fertilizer, they were starting to see a magnesium deficiency on their plant. So they're going to go ahead and have to use a magnesium sulfate drench to their poinsettia crop to try and increase the magnesium that they're providing to their plants. Perhaps something like this has had to be done in your crop to provide sufficient magnesium to the crop, and you might end up running the risk of, again, that nutrient antagonism because calcium will inhibit magnesium and magnesium will inhibit the uptake of calcium. A recommended ratio of calcium to magnesium for our fertilizers is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 parts per million calcium for every 1 part per million of magnesium. Another thing that we can do is apply a fungicide preventatively to try and prohibit root diseases from establishing. Like I already mentioned, when we have damaged roots, we have less transpiration, we have less calcium uptake. So that preventative fungicide application could be useful, not only for avoiding root rot and losses through root rot, but also to try and avoid that bract edge burn from forming. Another thing that we can do is apply calcium chloride sprays starting from first color through the sale of our crops. And that the recommended concentration is going to be anywhere from 3 to 400 parts per million, and add a non-ionic surfactant or spreader sticker to that mix when you're going to spray it on your crop. By applying calcium chloride sprays, we sort of bypass some of those problems that we run into in the root zone, like excessive magnesium concentrations. By applying that foliar spray of calcium chloride, we get the calcium onto the bract, and it doesn't need to be taken up through the vascular system in the plant and be translocated from the roots to the bract. Rather, it's going to get right on those bracts. And that's something that you can apply, again, weekly from first color through sale. Another thing that you want to think about is consider a preventative fungicide spray when you're run the risk of bract edge burn, because when bract edge burn starts, it'll form, if it gets advanced, you'll get a little bit of necrotic tissue on the margins of your leaf. And what will happen after that necrotic tissue forms, that's going to be a potential infection site for botrytis to come in. So it might be something to consider. So we've made it. The goal is to make it to this finish line. Again, we've got poinsettias that were started back in maybe it was late June, July. You've been propagating them, you've planted them, you've been growing them, you're starting to induce your flowers, you're almost there. So please stick with finishing our poinsettia crop. We're trying to grow, again, a very high quality crop on time. And hopefully today's presentation, looking at the growing environment, looking at plant culture, and looking at the most common physiological disorder, bract edge burn, hopefully you've got some tips and tricks that you can use as you're finishing your poinsettia crop. And hopefully this is going to help give you some things to keep an eye out for, be mindful of as we're in this finishing stretch. I know our poinsettias here at Iowa State University are just starting to break down chlorophyll. That just saw it for the first time on Monday. So we are getting ready for this finishing stretch here. And so I hope that you're going to be ready in your greenhouses as well, and that you've got some tips or tricks from today's presentation to help you. So with that, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come join the American Floral Endowment and me for this presentation. And I'd like to take any questions you have. But for those of you who don't, maybe you have to get going to get back in the greenhouse and you don't have time to ask questions, please take my email and my phone number down, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you've got after this webinar is concluded. So if you've got an idea that comes to you later, if you've got a question that comes to you later, please don't hesitate to get a hold of me, and I'm happy to support your growing. And with that, let's take some questions, Brian.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris, for that awesome presentation. I'd like to open up the floor for Q&A, and Chris is here and ready to answer your questions if you have any. We do have two right now, so we can just start off with the first one. You mentioned applying GA 1 to 2 weeks after flowering for improving bract size. To clarify, is that 1 to 2 weeks after cyathea formation?
Okay, it is going to be, we're talking about somewhere around a week or so before the cyathea have opened. So it's at the end of the coloration period. So at the, if you think about like an 8-week response group, it'd be around like week 6 or week 7 into the floral inductive period. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. And we have a second question from the same person, from Michael. Do you have any recommendations for bract-safe fungicides for botrytis?
Okay, so Michael, one of the things that I do is try to give the most accurate information as possible. And I cannot speak specifically on what specific products would be considered bract safe. And it's just my limitations and my knowledge of the active ingredients that are used. I just don't have one that I would confidently recommend. So I'm really sorry that I can't answer that, but I would rather be forthcoming than give you a misleading answer or speak out of my zone of comfortability. So I would suggest talking to other poinsettia growers who might have more experience. We usually don't spray. We don't usually have bract edge burn as a problem for a lot of the production that we're doing, at least in our greenhouses here, because we're using lights to promote uptake, and we're also using calcium chloride. So I just don't feel comfortable giving that, and I hope you understand why I might be hesitant to name names.
I think that's completely fair. We have another question from Catherine. Have you ever used a high rate of fertilizer above 500 parts per million nitrogen to increase height on poinsettia?
I have never used that. And although increasing the amount of fertilizers that we will provide to plants can boost the size of plants, I think that it's much more common to get a boost in plant growth with very fast growing plants, like say annuals. There you see the dose response of increased fertilizer and increased growth. I don't see the same amount of push resulting from increasing your fertilizer rates with poinsettia. So I would not increase my feed to get the height on poinsettia. Rather, I would look at using that combination BA-GA spray as quickly as possible after bracts have started to show some color to try and get a boost on height. I think that's going to be a more reliable approach to getting your boost in height than it is using those high salts, especially if you're looking at doing it after this, once color has started to form on the bracts.
Awesome. And then from Juan right now, we have, other than prevention, there is other way to come back from root disease. So is there any other way besides prevention?
Well, you can try and treat plants that maybe have been infected to try and slow the spread and then try and regrow new roots. So it's, again, trying to promote healthy plant growth, but that can be a real challenge.
Nate here has a question. Is it possible to have a molybdenum toxicity from adding too much supplemental?
Anything is possible, right? That's what I tell my daughters. It would depend, again, this is maybe not the clearest answer, but it would depend on how much molybdenum that you're adding to the plant. I would suspect that absolutely you could get a molybdenum toxicity if maybe you added too much on several occasions, or if you messed up. What was a good example? I once saw a student fry a poinsettia crop from capsule, a non-ionic surfactant, just because they mixed up the math. So it could be possible. In general, poinsettias are kind of one of the few crops that we grow in a greenhouse that have a notable molybdenum requirement. So they certainly require more than any other greenhouse crop that we're growing, but I'm sure they could experience a toxicity. I just can't tell you at what threshold that would occur, Nate. Sorry, I can't give you a more specific response.
I do truly believe that everybody has a poinsettia dread story. So I mean, it's not like this is new for something not to go well. So I guess I have a question myself.
Yeah, sure.
Racked edge burn. Are there other physiological disorders we should be aware of?
In finishing, I guess I'd think of a couple. One could be center drop. And you had someone mention the cyathea already. The bracts aren't technically the flower. We often talk about them as the number of blooms, but in the center, you've got those cyathea, and those are actually the flowers themselves. They seem insignificant, but if you go to a craft store and you buy a fake poinsettia, which I hope none of you are doing out there, you'll see that they actually have the cyathea in there, because that is kind of an integral part of what a poinsettia looks like, even though it might seem insignificant. If you have low light at the end of production, which can be common, again, because our outdoor ambient light levels are dropping. If you have insufficient light, you have insufficient photosynthesis, you have insufficient carbohydrate, those cyathea actually can, kind of like a bud blast, like you might see on a phalaenopsis. That can be one. You also can have stem splitting. And stem splitting can happen when you start to have inductive conditions. So we've got those short days that are starting to form, but then all of a sudden, maybe there's a security light on outside that turned on after you did your night checks for light pollution. And it might cause the conditions to revert back into non-inductive, and that reversion from an inductive photoperiod to a non-inductive photoperiod can cause that stem splitting to occur. Okay.
I want to remind everyone that you still can use the chat or the Q&A if you have any questions for Chris here. We here in our greenhouses had some, I guess it actually works out very well for your webinar today. We had some temperature issues and it was too hot. We had some pretty crazy bract edge burn. Do you have any, I guess, background knowledge or something like that?
So you have bract edge burn because it was too warm?
Oh, it was. I don't know that I should disclose the temperature of our greenhouse.
It's all right. That's why I live up here in Iowa and deer hunt in Wisconsin. So one of the interesting things is that you can also get bract edge burn, like you said, as a result of being too hot, and it's the same fundamental thing. It's a calcium deficiency. Mm-hmm. And what can happen is it's so warm, you have rapid transpiration. And like I mentioned earlier, the lack of the stomata on the margin of that leaf actually causes it to be a weak sink for that transpirational draw compared to other leaves or compared to the center of that bract. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing that you see if you're growing hydroponic lettuce. So you can get bract edge burn, or you can get what we'd call tip burn in lettuce. It's the same thing. It's going to be calcium deficiency on the leaf edge. You can get it from insufficient transpiration and insufficient calcium uptake. You can also get it from excessive transpiration, where those margins of the leaf can't compete with other parts of the leaf for transpiration. So they're not able to pull that calcium or transpire when you have such rapid transpiration. So in that instance, and I know this is probably a challenge in the greenhouses that you're growing, but it would be to cool them down to try and grow them slower.
Right, and we hit them with PGRs multiple times to try and cool them down a bit as ingrowth, not temperature, because that temperature wasn't going to go anywhere. And
and that's a hard part. We can always heat a greenhouse up to a set point, but just energetically speaking, it's hard to cool it down just because unless you're a phalaenopsis grower and you have air conditioning.
Wouldn't that be nice? Well, since there is no more questions here in the Q&A or the chat, I will continue my trek to get more information out of you. So I'll ask one more.
Sure.
You mentioned the difference between light and dark-leaved cultivars, and that's definitely a current topic with new cultivars every year when talking about temperature. So are there other aspects to growing them where they're different from each other?
Yeah, so when we talk about light and dark leaf cultivars, we're not talking about the bract, but we're actually talking about the green leaves themselves, the vegetative foliage. And I was talking about how the light leaf cultivars are a little bit less suitable for those cold temperatures. There are a couple other differences. One is going to be the light level that they're grown in, and then the other is going to be the nutrition level that you provide them. And the differences all come down to that leaf color, and that greenness is going to be based on the amount of chlorophyll that's in the leaf. The lighter leaf cultivar is going to have less chlorophyll, whereas the dark leaf cultivar is going to have more chlorophyll. So given that physiological difference of higher chlorophyll concentrations in dark leaf cultivars and lower chlorophyll concentrations in the lighter leaf cultivars, when it comes to managing light, you can generally use a little bit lower light intensity or a lower daily light integral with the darker leaf cultivars because they've got so much chlorophyll, they're able to absorb all of the light that's coming down on that leaf. Alternatively, you're going to want to try and get a higher light intensity or a higher daily light integral with that light leaf cultivar because with fewer chlorophyll molecules, they're able to harvest fewer of those photons. So that's why you want more light to try and keep saturating those photons. Now, when it comes to fertilizer, it's going to be the opposite. Because of that high chlorophyll density in the dark leaf cultivars, they've got more machinery, quote unquote. So they're going to require generally a higher level of fertilization or a higher nitrogen concentration, just because more chlorophyll is going to be more proteins in the leaf, more to maintain. Whereas the light leaf cultivars, generally you can use or would want to use a lower concentration of fertilizer or a lower nitrogen concentration because with less chlorophyll, there's just less, again, chlorophyll, less machinery to maintain. Right.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem.
And so with that, I guess we'll close it out here. Thank you for joining us today for another session of AFE's Grow Pro webinar series. Join us next month for Dr. John Irwin's presentation on flowering and forcing of perennials on Tuesday, November 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. You can register the same way you did before at endowment.org/GoPro, which is also there in the chat box. And while you're there, check out our past webinar recordings, other grower-related resources, and research reports available to you for free. Thank you. Thanks to the industry support. We ask that you please complete the brief survey, if possible, about today's session, where you can suggest additional topics and help us continue to improve these webinars. So I really do think these are making a big impact on whoever gets to watch them. And thank you again for joining us today, and have an awesome rest of your week.